Hello, my name is Vinton Hoyk, and this is a coloring tutorial using a page from my graphic novel I am producing with Byron Penaranda called MABIGON. You'll see the flatting process, which I'm not going to go into too much here. There's lots of good tutorials on that. It was very simple, just a complementary blue and an orange. I created a color hue layer on top of that flats layer, and then filled it with that same orange color, and just played around with the opacity just to kind of merge the two together. It is a monochromatic scene, and different ways you could do that. I could have selected the colors on the flats separately and just played around, but this is just a nice quick way to do it. Now, you'll see I have a flat layer that's locked because you don't want to make sure that you don't mess those up. And you also want to make sure, just a brief thing on flatting, when you do your flats, that your tools, primarily you'll be using a lasso tool, paint bucket, magic wand, you want to make sure all the anti-alias and the contiguous selections are unchecked, so you have nice clean selections. And you don't want to color on that flat layer, so you can have really as many layers as you want on top of that. You can play around and then merge them down. I don't have to do a lot of that here. This is a relatively simple scene. So I do have a colors layer that I'm working on over the flats layer. You'll notice that that's underneath the black and white line art that's on top of that. On multiply, so you can see through the line work, that line art layer is also locked because you don't want to mess that up by accident either. The color layer is in between the flats and the line art layer, and since that line art is on multiply, you can see the colors coming through. Now, what I've done here is I haven't changed the color. It may seem like I have, but I haven't. It's just the brush is set on a color dodge setting. That color dodge gives it a nice, kind of intense, bright, glowing feeling without actually changing the color. Another way to get that glow or that lighter color out of the color that is on the normal setting would be to use the screen brush. Now, as you use that continually, that brush, as you color over and over, will eventually go to white. And I don't want to do that yet. Right now I'm just trying to get that hot, warm, yellowy fire look. And the color dodge brush works well for that. Use the brush setting on with different sizes. You see, I start off with a big brush. You'll notice also that the opacity and flow of that brush were down to like 50% and 40% respectively. Generally, if you go lower than that, you're having to spend too much time going over and over trying to build up that that airbrush feel. If it's higher, then it's too much. So 40-50% for opacity and flow is kind of a good middle ground for using just the brush in general for coloring, I find. Now, you've seen I've moved ahead to the screen brush. Now, I've already established that yellow glow, and really think any lighter than that is going to go to white, so I just went ahead and selected white. I'm not sure the screen brush on a white setting is really any different than the normal brush with white, so that just seemed a good place to go for the next step of continuing to layer on the color to increase that glowing fire look. Now, you'll see what I've done here is I put a layer on top of the line art layer. Now there's various ways you can take that black line art of the fire and kind of make it less kind of like a hard black line. You could select them and do color holds, which I won't get into. In this case, I'm just putting a layer on top of the line art layer, and I'm using that same brush to color over the top, and that's covering the black line art layer, but with the opacity down, so it just kind of fades it back a little. Now, one of the things I did prior to this was just look at real life fire scenes, buildings on fire, forest fires at night, and I noticed the embers of these structures would, in contrast to the flames themselves, would be very dark, sometimes almost black. So I want to make those shapes kind of pop out more of the structure. So I just created, in this case, I created a new layer on top of the color layer. You know, like I said, you can create as many layers as you want and merge them down when you're happy with them. So right now I'm just sort of experimenting with this. I've never really done a scene like this before. And then when I'm happy with it, I'll merge it down with the colors layer. So here I'm just selecting the timbers, the burning timbers that are also burnt. I tested one with a little bit of brush and liked the way it looked. Now I'm just going in and selecting all the rest. And this, by the way, if it seems like this is happening a little on the fast side, it's because the video I took is actually slightly sped up. And I'm just sitting here narrating over the top of it. Alright, there I'm going in with the normal brush. I pressed Command H to hide the marching ants of the magic wand so I could better see what I'm doing. Well, actually it was the lasso tool that I used to select all these. And then I'm just going over the brush. In this case, I've turned down the opacity to 15%. I just sort of want to slowly kind of build up the brush opacity. Don't want to go too dark too fast. The approach I'm taking here is, I wouldn't say painterly, it's definitely airbrushed, but it's kind of all built up by taking multiple passes. See, I haven't touched the figure or the ground yet at this point. I'm still all working just on the fire part of the page. Right. Now I'm going in, as you can see, with something that's pretty close to black. And again, the opacity is still down pretty low to 15%. flows at 50%. Trying to achieve what I saw in those photographs. It's always good to draw from life as much as possible, of course. And then there I just experimented with a different brush. It just didn't work. Here I'm using the Soto brush, which has a slightly different texture to it. Really, I'm just kind of experimenting with different things. You know, I want the fire to fade up into smoke and night as it gets towards the top of the page. There, as he's going with that darker airbrush, kind of brings out the shapes more. And reduce the size of the whole page every so often. That's kind of the equivalent to standing back from your painting to see how the whole thing is working. Going back and forth, eyeing it, trying to get what feels right. Feels pretty good. Has a decent amount of contrast between the dark embers and the hot flame. And there I went ahead and I selected the figure. The figure is the focal point of the whole page. It's our main character walking out of the flames of a place he's just totally laid waste to and set afire. A little too stark on its own, so as I did before with the layer on top of the line art layer, I am airbrushing over the top of the black line itself. So the dark figure is picking up some of the glow of the flame and merging into the scene more. Alright, now it's time to work on the ground. I'm using the magic lasso to roughly follow the contours of the uneven ground. I'm going to throw in some darker tones to give it more shape. My approach to coloring is pretty much the same as it was when I used to paint in acrylics, which is when I flat, I basically use mid-tones and then I do dark tones and light tones over the top of that base. Right, so I just keep selecting areas that I feel are a little more recessed into the shadow of the firelight. Using the color picker, take that same color of the ground and just make it a darker color. Take your brush and fill it in. Here I'm using, again, a different brush. Just trying out different brushes. My tool presets. Seeing what works, what doesn't. And that's the great thing about Photoshop. You can experiment all you like. And as long as you're working on different layers, it's very easy to delete and try again. You can see I'm doing this since it's not a brush I've used a lot. I'm not quite sure how it's going to turn out. I'm doing it on a new layer I've created over my main colors layer. That way if I don't like it, I can just delete it. The more layers you have, the more options you have. But I did feel that that spongy brush might give me an interesting texture to the ground that's basically dirt. Now, to bring that fire into the scene, I created yet another layer, and using a nice fiery yellow on a screen setting, I'm attempting to bring that into the ground layer. Notice I have the fire glow on top of this, the ground with the shadows, all in different layers. I'm just moving the different layers around, seeing what they look like in different order. A lot of this still is playing around for me. I've been a professional artist for a long time. I painted a little bit traditionally when I was younger. I was a professional comic book penciler for a while before I moved into animation as a storyboard artist and later a director. So I had a decent color sense and I had some skills, but digital coloring is actually relatively recent for me. And so I'm still at the stage where, although I do have a good basic knowledge and I am able to achieve decent results, I still end up playing with lots of different things to see what they do. And I encourage you to do the same. You'll find there's really, in Photoshop, there's no one single way to do this. There's good basic skills. I think every comic book colorist should know, particularly when it comes to flatting. But then there's really a million different ways to skin a cat, as they say, and many different ways to achieve the same result. One of the things I can highly recommend beyond this tutorial, if this is something that interests you or whets your appetite, and you want to know more, that's something I did recently myself, which you'll see the tool presets with all these brushes, by the way, I got from that tutorial as a download, was a tutorial by Michael Russell. And I found some of his free tutorials on YouTube. They were very good, and I went ahead and took the course and really got a lot of great information from there, some of which I'm applying here. So here we are, we're getting pretty close to the end. One of the last things I'll do is play with the levels of the whole piece to try and create more contrast. So we're getting towards the end here. Although the flames are not hard shapes the way the timbers are, I still want to honor the line work underneath and highlight that. So I'm using the lasso to select some of these flame shapes, and then I'm going to make those pop a bit more. Now, of course, when you're using the lasso tool, the way you make more than one selection is just to hold down, I believe it's the option, it's kind of automatic for me, it's the option key, I believe, but it'll create a little plus sign on that lasso tool, and then you can add additional selections. I went ahead again and hit the Command H to hide the selections, at least for a second there. But I turned it back on because I do want to see where some of those bottom edges are. And there, as I again shrink it down a bit and kind of step back, I can see some of those flame shapes starting to emerge a bit more, which is what I want. Here I'm continuing to do that process. We're actually getting fairly close to the end of the tutorial here. Just sort of building it all up slowly, taking multiple passes with the brushes, with the opacity and fill turned down, working in multiple layers to give myself more options, merging them down to keep the process relatively simple once I'm happy with them. Here you see I'm coloring on top of the line art layer again. stepping back, trying to see how the whole thing is working. It's working pretty well. I'm pretty happy with it. If you like this tutorial and you'd like to see more, let me know. I probably will try and create at least one more, just because this one is so relatively simple, and I think people would probably like to see how I approach multiple light sources, skin tones. I have another page I'm working on that's a night scene. There's really a lot to think about when it comes to coloring for comics these days. There's so many options that an artist has that he didn't used to have. If you like what you see here, you'd like to know more about the comic, check us out. We have a Facebook page. If you just type in MABIGON on a search, it'll come right up, and I'll make sure and post the information below.